Welcome to the Global Economic Challenges Network. We have over 1,900 of you who've signed up, and I already see over 300 are already connected. It's a great pleasure to have you all here today. The Global Economic Challenges Network has been spearheaded by Georgetown University and Solvay at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, along with many other prominent institutions. The network was really created with the ambition of facilitating discussion on important economic challenges facing our world. And we've been sponsoring a series of international workshops that bring together leading scholars with policymakers to discuss the most pressing economic problems of our century. We have special thanks today to Georgetown, to the Université Libre de Bruxelles, the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, and the Center for Economic Policy and Research, who are the sponsors of today's event. This is actually our third event. The first one was an in-person event last November in 2019. We discussed the future of labor. Our second event was already virtual. It brought together a distinguished group of economists, immunologists, and policymakers from the both public and private sector to discuss how to reopen world economies in the presence of COVID-19. Today, we're yet again with a very distinguished group of economists, renowned academics, and policymakers to discuss how a global crisis, as the one we're living, is de facto acting as a stress test on the national, especially on the national, but also global institutions. As usual, a very special thank you to Georgetown's Frank Vella and Solvay's Michael Castanheira, without whom and their energy, we wouldn't have been able to set up this third discussion. Special thanks also to Optimum Audio and AI Media, who for their technical support of the event. We're gonna kick off. For the Q&A, please use our hashtag, which is available at GCNet, and we will be taking your questions, and hopefully after the discussion, around 40 minutes, we will be opening it to the public. We're gonna start off with Daron Acemoglu, an institute professor from the economics from MIT. It's a great honor to have him here today. You may know he's the author of several books. The most recent one is The Narrow Corridor, State, Society, and the Fate of Liberty. His academic work covers a wide range of areas, especially political economy, institutions, economic development, economic growth, and inequality. He's been awarded the John Bates Clark Medal in 2005, the Aaron Plen-Nimmers Prize in 2012, and the 2016 BBVA Frontiers of Knowledge Award. Daron, we're going to start with you with why the West was so unprepared to address the challenges of COVID crisis, which lessons should be learned, but also super interesting, which lessons should not be learned from what happened. It's up to you. Thank you, Daron.
Thank you, Sherazad. It's a great pleasure to be here with you, Sherazad, with Laurence, with Matthias, and with Marco. Unfortunately, that's the end of my happiness. Everything else I'm going to say is not as cheery. We live in a troubled world. The COVID-19 is an exceptional crisis, but it is even more serious than it would have been under regular circumstances because it hit us at a low point for our institutions, creating, in my mind, the most severe challenges the world has faced since World War II. Leaving the huge number of lives lost aside, a very difficult thing to leave aside, I think the real danger is that it has exposed how atrophied our institutions are. It is truly spectacular how our institutions have failed in this process, especially in the US and the UK, but also to some degree in the rest of the West. This was never going to be an easy crisis for the world to shoulder, because given the situation about the structure of the COVID virus, which hits people with comorbidities and health conditions, decades of increasing inequality, including increasing inequality in health resources, would have made the population very susceptible. And this is one of the weaknesses of societies such as the US, the UK, Brazil, that have made them even harder to deal with the health consequences. But two other factors, I think, are really at the root of the challenges and the failures that we are facing. One, echoing the theme of the webinar, is that we live at a point in our history where trust in institutions has completely eroded. This has many roots. I'm sure we can come back to this, especially in light of Matthias and Marco's comments, which are going to be much more connected to the European context and previous crises as well. But I think the way that the West has handled the global financial crisis has contributed to the erosion of public trust in institutions, and there have been other long-ranging trends that have brought us to a level where people's beliefs in democracy, in competence, in impartiality are at an all-time low. This makes it very hard for institutions to handle a very different type of challenge and find creative solutions and bring people together. But even more severe is the actual collapse of expertise, autonomy, and independent decision-making in civil societies and bureaucracies. Again, this is most visible in the US and the UK, but I believe it's a more widespread phenomenon. Take, for instance, just as a snippet, the case of CDC, which has in the past distinguished itself as one of the very successful science-based, expertise-based institutions in the United States and has successfully dealt with pandemics. It is inconceivable to people who know the CDC's history that this organization, which is completely dedicated to control of pandemics, gets word of a virus that has a basic reproduction rate of near 3 and a mortality rate that, at least according to early reports, was around 2%, and does essentially nothing for 3 months, from beginning of January to middle of March. How is that? How did we come to that point? I think it's a parable of the broader set of failures in expertise-based decision-making. And it happens when, of course, politicians make it harder. The public trust's lack makes it harder, but also bureaucracies and civil servants themselves give up on their duties to society and to the ethos that they have to impartial and expertise-based decision-making. And I think all of those have happened in the CDC, in their passivity, in their inability to steer the discussion, in their inability to warn the public, in their inability to make the right preparations, but it's much more widespread in the United States than the CDC, of course. These two institutional failures, lack of trust, and collapse of expertise-based autonomous decision-making, are actually self-reinforcing. They create a type of vicious circle, because the more you lose this expertise-based decision-making, the less the civil service can return results, and that in turn exacerbates lack of trust, and lack of trust makes it even harder for the bureaucracy to get cooperation from society, and that makes it even more difficult to get results in turn. What is scary is that we see these two developments in many of the collapses of democratic and competent institutions in the past, not least in Italy when fascism was rising, or Germany when the Weimar Republic collapsed. You have these twin self-reinforcing trends of collapse in public institutions, and together with it their impartiality that then deepens the crisis. So this all, together with the severity of the COVID-19 crisis, generates a situation which James Robinson and I called in our book Why Nations Fail a critical juncture, a point when institutions are no longer up to the task of dealing with the current problems, and a major institutional change becomes likely. But a distinguishing feature of critical junctures is that they are not deterministic events where we can easily predict in what direction institutions are going to change. It depends on pre-existing balances of power, strengths and weaknesses of institutions, and agency, meaning the leadership of politicians, the ways that civil society and various different coalitions form. And those, in turn, very much depend on what types of lessons we learn from the failure and how we channel those lessons. And there, I believe, one of the concerns to add to the already bleak picture that I've painted is that we are probably likely to learn the wrong lessons. For example, one common narrative is that what we are seeing in the US and the UK and parts of Europe is a failure of democracy. And only if we had adopted a more Chinese-style approach with greater ability of the government to coordinate actions, because the government can do that without consulting with civil society, without going through checks and balances and silencing all sorts of oppositions, then we would have been more successful, just like China was. And that sort of reading of our recent history would then suggest that we should try to emulate China. I would call that a China light strategy, not just because I don't think anybody would seriously suggest that we go in full China direction, but actually, even if you tried it, you would not be able to replicate anything close to the Chinese system. We would actually end up with the worst features of the Chinese system: less media freedom, less checks on presidential or executive authority, less democratic decision-making, less voice for civil society, less ability for consensus-driven policies to be implemented. But the good part of the Chinese system, which was the one that after the initial denials and severity and making the COVID situation more severe early on, actually helped containment, which was the capacity of the bureaucratic system that we would not be able to emulate. We would not be able to emulate that precisely because if you look at Chinese history, it was a very long struggle, a long process for a competent bureaucracy to emerge and shield itself from authoritarian, often repressive governments in a process of extending over 2,000 years. The most immediate thing that would happen if we go in a direction that silences the media and civil society would be that we would actually further weaken our bureaucracy, and any sort of true expertise or science-based policymaking within organizations such as Environmental Protection Agency, health agencies, Central for Disease Control, financial and banking agencies would start evaporating even faster. Another lesson we could incorrectly learn is that governments are bound to fail. This is a rhetoric that you hear a lot from the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs and employees, that our only hope is to rely more on technology and the captains of the technology, the tech firms and their leaders, because if we want to, for example, implement contact tracing or better understanding of what's going on to the disease, we're much better off turning to companies, not to the government. Again, that would be the wrong lesson, because that would be not only another contributor to inequality and the further weakening of government institutions, but would also weaken the fundamental tenets of democratic accountability. So if those are the wrong lessons, what I would say would be the right lessons is actually not an easy one, but in some level quite clear. What we are experiencing right now is many different aspects of risk, inequity, and difficulties of adjusting to change. Those are all roles that traditionally, at least over the last 80 years, governments have played in terms of bolstering the market system. A social welfare state was very much initiated because of these types of concerns. Even before the crisis came, the extent of inequality created by automation, globalization, and various other types of economic risks were very much high, and our existing social welfare state was not up to the task of dealing with them. Now, to that list have been added various types of health issues that we have to play a much more global coordinating role, both supranational and intranational. We have the additional difficult problems of balancing privacy regulations on individual social behavior. That's not going to be the last time that we experience all of these things. And all of those tenets really require additional responsibilities on the shoulders of the state. Now, at this point, you might say, wait, isn't that just one more step in the Chinese direction? More power to the state, more responsibilities, more authority to the state? And the answer is not necessarily. In fact, this is exactly the type of realization that in Europe and later spreading to the US, that triggered the construction of welfare states after World War II. In all of these cases, there were much greater responsibilities on the shoulders of the state, both economically, where the tax revenues and the spending reached levels that were completely unrivaled before. The ability of the government to penetrate different aspects of the society deepened. But all of these actually took place not in a purely or largely authoritarian setting. There were many people at the time who worried about this heralding a new type of totalitarianism. Friedrich Hayek most famously wrote his Road to Serfdom as a warning against these types of welfare states. But in fact, what Hayek was wrong about was that the greater responsibilities on the shoulders of the state necessarily mean more dictatorial states. And this is exactly what we experienced very successfully in most of the West, which is that democracy deepened and civil society became more active, not more meek, in dealing with the states. And it was a process of balancing the greater powers of the state with greater participation in political decision-making, in social conversation, and greater ability of the society to turn politicians more into servants rather than autocrats. This is exactly what we have to aim for. It's not an easy process, and today it may be actually harder than it was in the 1940s because we live in a more polarized and more damaged society in many ways. But I believe there are many reasons why doing exactly the same, but in a very different context, is always feasible. And those were actually some of the themes that Jim Robinson and I tried to touch in or explore in our more recent book, The Narrow Corridor. Of course, time is short, so I'm not going to say much more about that. But I will end by noting that what Europe and on its coattails the US achieved in the decades following World War II is not in some sense exceptional. Of course, it was the happiest 3 decades in terms of economic growth, productivity growth. But if you look at human history for the last 3,000 years, you have several other examples of society and state balancing each other and completely different political structures emerging out of them that would have happened either with weakness and atrophying of the state or just dictatorial authoritarian imposition of the states and elites' will on society. That happy balance is something that has been created time and again in history, and I think we owe it to ourselves to try it for the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daron. We will be coming back to you with questions. Before we continue with our panelists, just again, if you're watching us live on a platform such as YouTube or another platform, please ask your questions on Twitter using the hashtag GECNetwork. And if you're on Zoom, we've got the Q&A, which is open, the button just on the bottom of your screen. Laurence Boone, we're delighted to have you and very honored to have you with us today. Laurence Boone is the chief economist of OECD. She's the former AXA Group chief economist. She was a special advisor for multilateral and European economic and financial affairs and a G20 Sherpa to the presidency of the French Republic. And as such, she managed many of the negotiations at the G20 and the relationship, obviously, with the EU institutions, IMF, and the EU member states. Laurence, you will be reminding us on why and how maybe some of these institutions were created to encourage really international cooperation, and your take on where we stand on this international cooperation today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. So I will effectively focus on the subject you've just mentioned, but just before starting, I thought I would share a couple of slides with you about trust in institutions, since Daron talked quite a little about it, and then I'll move to the OECD. So let me start. I just wanted to say that perhaps the picture is quite diverse, and we shouldn't also get misled by what's happening with the COVID crisis. And because it's quite striking to see that at the beginning of the crisis, the trust in government has actually increased, and it increased quite significantly, as you can see from the left-hand side chart. But when we look a little deeper on the right-hand side, what we see is decisive action, and I will come back to this when I talk about the OECD history. Decisive action is actually boosting confidence, and then effectively this boost tends to fade away with the periods of confinement or treatment of the COVID crisis. So we're seeing a cyclical resurgence of confidence, but really the situation is much more complex than that, because as you can see from this chart, the trust in institution is very diverse. Here you have European countries, and the EU are the little dark line, and I'm not going to stay long on this chart, don't be afraid, but what I wanted to show is two things. First, it's very diverse across countries. And that's one of the elements which makes the evolution of international institutions as well as government difficult. And the second one is, you can see from this little red block and the green one, which tends to have the highest score across country, is that trust is higher for those institutions that have a very well-defined objective. And I think we should keep that in mind when we talk about reviewing international institutions. And just the last one before moving to the OECD, I just wanted to make the link with what Daron was saying before and show how much trust is important, especially when it comes to public good. And I will be talking about this for the evolution of international institutions. What this chart shows is that the higher public trust in political institution is, and the higher the carbon price. And that's a way of representing that when there is a strong trust in government and therefore a strong trust in the political leaders, then implementing policies like carbon price, which is challenging to address climate change, which is challenging for many countries, it's actually much easier. So it's very important. It's just a motivation to show how important I think it is to enhance trust in an institution. But now with this short introduction, let me go back to my original mandate. And what you can see here is some archive photo about the OEEC, which is really what gave birth to the OECD. So it was the Organization for European and Economic Cooperation. And as most of you know, this, which is the parent of the OECD, was built up and designed to implement the Marshall Plan, which was quite a significant amount of money from the US, about 12 billion. Which was spent between 1948 and 1950 and split about 24% for the UK, 20% for France, 11% for Italy and Germany. And in fact, this international organization had two main economic mandates that were really, really clear, which is why I was focusing on the objective. One was trade liberalization, and the other was managing the European payment system. So it had to, the institution was in charge of helping to remove the obstacle of inconvertibility of European currencies, to remove quantity restrictions, and to suppress bilateral commercial practices. And there was a fund which was created to actually make compensation across country. And this was extremely successful up to the point that it was dissolved in December 58 when all the currencies were declared convertible with the dollar. And that obviously created a discussion on the purpose of this Organization for European Economic Cooperation since it had achieved the objective. And what I think is interesting, particularly interesting in today's context, is achieving the objective triggered a huge discussion between some part of the OEC, which were in favor of a free trade agreement and just a free trade agreement, and other part of the OEC, which were in favor of more political and economic integration. And then the US relationship played within this, so that at the end, what happened is in effect the split of the OEC into something that was transatlantic with the economic arm of NATO, where the US became a member, and then later on Canada and Japan, and then Australia and New Zealand on the one hand. And on the other hand, this gave birth to the European Economic Community, which we know then became later on the EU. So the point of this story is to really explain that first, a very strong purpose is actually helping to achieve something with international institutions. But also that once this objective is achieved, reinventing itself is possible. And I think it's the OECD managed that not only with by defining its objective, but also by having an evolution of its philosophy and membership throughout the year. And let me move to this slide to illustrate this. So I want to make a few points with this. What you can see is the membership of the OECD from the OEEC. So it moves from a European membership, which you can see here, to this transatlantic one I was describing. And then what we are seeing is that this represents a decreasing share of world GDP. But there are a couple of things I want to say here. First, it was very attractive, and it is very attractive because it's a consensus-based house where things can be discussed without sovereign obligation. They take precedent on national governments. And I'll come back to this for the international institution evolution, but I think this is key. That's actually a forum for discussion. It can be used to discuss agreement that will be bring forward to other international organizations. It also works with peer pressure. So what the OECD does basically today is standardized data, surveys, and one of the most famous one, which is about education with PISA, they survey across students in the world. And the benchmarking and the harmonized data is actually a way for government to rank themselves, and for civil servants, who Daron mentioned, for civil servants to be able to elaborate policies or compare themselves, trusting and relying on something that's comparable across country. So it's data. First, it's ideal for economics and economic policy analysis. So it's a place where people actually elaborate and forge what's best practice, what's models, conceptual framework. They can share a narrative, which they can bring afterward. And it's something that was initially mostly disseminated among policymakers, and then they could bring that home and show expertise to implement policies. And I think that's in a way how international institutions have worked quite a lot until now. What I would like to say is this economic cooperation, and that's my second point, has actually been a success. And the chart precisely shows that it has been a success. Why? Because what you see here is that if the share of, as a percent of world GDP of developed economies, advanced economies has declined, that means that the share of emerging market economies has increased. So they have actually caught up. And this economic cooperation has been a success. But the success has not meant that it was attractive. Strangely, in fact, it has not boosted at all international cooperation. And I want to make 3 points at this stage. First is about governance. And the fact is that governance is more complicated when you have more countries. and also when they take their roots into institutions that already existed. And that's one of the issues that the OEEC faced when transformed to the OECD. And why? Either because decision-making power is and remains highly concentrated, with a small proportion of members of an organization having a key influence, or because decision-making is by consensus, and that obviously reduces the appeal of the outcome that you have of negotiation. It's more difficult to get something more impactful. And the result of this has been some disengagement for some countries, because the benefits that are expected from international agreements appear too costly compared to the benefits that it brings at the national policy level. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're struggling a little more now. So there's one avenue, which is that we have more flexible agreements or agreements with limited club of countries with more concrete commitment, but I don't think that works for some objects of global cooperation. So let me make quickly 3 points about where I see room for development, or as we say, areas for improvement. The first one is focusing on the theme. Even if we had some evolution with more inclusive, more sustainable, greener growth, I think we should think about the theme a little differently, and Danny Roderick talked about it. And I think there are two elements in there. One is focus on public goods. So the public goods, it's the topics for which the lack of commitment from one country can harm all the other countries. And the obvious one is obviously climate and health. And here, there are obvious reasons to cooperate. The second type is beggar thy neighbor's arguments. And that's areas where the benefit or the privilege of a very few is realized to the detriment of many others. And you can think about anti-competitive behavior thanks to digitalization or tax practices, which benefit a small number of countries, but to the detriment of the greatest number. So these are things, are way to bring forward the object of international cooperation. The second point I want to make is I also think that there's scope to simplify and make cooperation more direct. We had a very normative vision of international cooperation with rules, with treaties, but we can go beyond that. And in particular, I think more benchmarking is one of them, but peer and popular pressure is also a very powerful tool. For example, if you take the tax transparency agreement that the OECD is developing, this is based on commitment of more than 100 countries. There's no sanction. Popular and civil pressure are usually enough to make this move forwards. And that's also because I think today, and this is something Daron was alluding to, perceived equity and fairness is a very powerful engine to boost international cooperation. That will be true for health. I think it's especially true for tax transparency, and it will be true as well for commitments for climate. And with that, I think I want to end here and on a positive note, which shows that the trust in international organization is actually quite high. This was a survey made by the World Bank, so I have no advertising for that. But as you can see, there is hope that we can make things move even better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laurence. And we will be coming back because I see there are many questions coming in. Marco Buti, thank you so much for being with us today. Marco Buti was the former Director General for Economic and Financial Affairs at the European Commission, DG ICFIN, as we say in town. He is now the Chief of Staff of the Commissioner for Economy, Paolo Gentiloni, who's been quite in the news also with a huge responsibility. He has been Marco was also the commission, has been at the Commission of Finance Deputy at the G7 and of the G20, and he's published extensively on economic and monetary union. Today, Marco, I think we would love to hear from you. How is COVID different from the previous recessionary shocks for the European project? And as we're talking a lot about the recovery plan in town right now, how would you frame where the European Union is standing today? Thank you so much.
It's nice to be here and nice to be amongst very good friends. So Daron, Laurence, and then Matthias coming after me. I have a couple of slides. I have one take-home message, which you may want to retain at the end of this presentation. I give it to you straight away. If we do the right things in Europe, we have a chance, but only a chance, obviously not a certainty, to provide a model to avoid the dystopian outcomes outlined by Daron in his intervention. Quite a bold statement. Let's see if I manage to convince you to provide a rationale for this. We go to my first slide. Okay, here you can see one of the many inconsistent trinities. This is a European translation or Roderick globalization trilemma. So basically what you cannot do is attain at the same time deep economic integrations, democratic legitimacy, and based the decision-making essentially on national institutions. So you can achieve two of them, not the three at the same time. In the history of the European Union, we have solved the triangle trilemma in different ways. I mean, the first one, you can see the A solution here is essentially an institution building a supranational level. Typical of this is the single market established in the 1980s and the creation of economic and monetary union with the ECB in the 1990s. So we actually built strong institutions at the supranational level. The second one is the B solution. Here you keep together the deep political integration and national institutions. It is essential an intergovernmental decision making. So there is not a devolution to supranational institutions, but there is cooperation between governments which retain fully their sovereignty. And this was, with some exceptions, and actually Matthias after me, I understand will touch upon this. It is the type of decision-making with a strong role of leaders in the European Council, which prevailed during the financial crisis post-2008. And finally, you have the C, which is democratic legitimacy and national institutions. Then you give up on deep political integration. And a recent example is the handling of the immigration crisis in the mid-2010, where de facto we did not manage to achieve a common immigration policy at the European level. So the question is, how will this inconsistent trinity be addressed in the COVID-19 crisis? And my conclusion here is that we have a chance to go for solution A. So actually building a supranational, credible supranational response with strong institutions, which I think it would be the first best in this case. If you go to the next slide, you will see I have tried here to outline, taking up your initial question, Shahrazad, is the main features of the financial crisis versus the COVID-19 crisis. You do not have to go through all this, the various lines and different parameters. What I have outlined here and put in red is what is essential in my view for the topic at hand. Basically, for the financial crisis, we did not have a joint narrative. This has haunted the policy response at the European level since the very beginning, and it has haunted us for basically 10 years. There were different views on this, and as a consequence, we could not find quickly a proper common solution. So we went for the ultima ratio. So we found the courage to act only when we stared into the abyss of the euro area, sovereign crisis. So this hampered a proper response, and the result of this was an intergovernmental view where leaders had a role, but there was not the typical devolution of sovereignty at the supranational level. Today, we are in a different world. I think there is much more of a consensual view, a consensual narrative. Here, the crisis is obviously seen not as a policy-induced one, but as something coming, purely exogenous, common in origin and asymmetric in outcomes. As a consequence of this, there is no moral hazard concerns, which is usually put forward by Germany and other countries. So it has been much more favorable, the situation, to go for supranational solution, which are those currently under discussion, with a strong role for the European budget, for what we call the Recovery and Resilience Facility, based on common borrowing on the part of the EU budget. All this has been favored also by what you see here in my very last line, which is international cooperation. Laurence mentioned this in her presentation. I mean, de facto, the common experience here is that we had, during the financial crisis, strong determination, especially at the level of the G20. At the beginning of the crisis, I recall the summit in London, where we decided to triple the resources of the IMF. Very strong involvement of the US also in pushing Europe to do the right things during the sovereign euro area crisis. To the contrary, today I put here in a euphemism, say, limited role of international cooperation. So the awareness in Europe that we have to take our destiny in our own hands, to provide a proper response. We go to my further slide, which is you will find here, which is basically my very final one before coming to the conclusion. So if we go for a solution, so more supranational, a supranational approach, what would be the outcome of this in concrete terms? I think here in Europe in particular, coordination is on the one hand based on institution building, typically EMU on the creation of the ECB, and complementing the institution building, also there are more rules-based of coordination, which is, typical example is the Stability and Growth Pact, so the fiscal rules. You see here during the financial crisis, there was a strong role for intergovernmental decision-making, and also what eventually was translated in community rules had started in the decision as an intergovernmental decision-making. What we are going to have in the COVID-19 crisis instead is the creation of a Recovery and Resilience Facility. The proposal of the Commission is an overall package of 750 billion. So with the attempt here to have a much more balanced policy mix compared to the financial crisis, so not leaving everything on the shoulders of the ECB, but having a more an important role of fiscal policy and vertical coordination, so fiscal policy not only at the national level, but also at the EU level. And then in terms of rules-based, we have activated the general escape clause. This is the mean of the Stability Pact. This means basically that the rules of the pact are suspended. So we will see in the next months what to do with that and how to review the rules to make it compatible with the proper response to the crisis. So this is what my overall assessment is, comparing also my personal experience during this crisis and during the previous crisis. I think we have much, higher chance this time to overcome the division which haunted us during the financial crisis between creditors and debtors. I think we are much more under the what Raoul's called the veil of ignorance. So when we do reforms not knowing who would benefit ex ante. And what we know for clear, I think there is a clear awareness also in strong countries in Europe, is that the losers of yesterday and the winners of yesterdays are not necessarily the losers and the winners of tomorrow, especially in a deglobalized world, or in a world where international cooperation is somewhat weaker than we had in the past. The Europe has then a chance to, I think, provide a model to avoid what Daron outlined at the beginning. I think there is certainly on the demand side, there is a lot of demand for Europe. I mean, we see that in the G20. I think there is an issue of the supply of Europe, and I think what is on the table has the chance to provide that. Just one final word is just as an example, is data management and data handling. What we know is that, and it is said, simplifying a bit, is that in the US, data belong to companies. In China, data belong to the state. In Russia, data belong to the Secret Service. And in Europe, data belong to citizens. I think this type of approach, I think, provides a much better, much more hopeful perspective for renewing liberal democracy than what is happening in other parts of the world. Just a chance if we seize it. Thank you.
Thank you. Love the way you ended your last sentences. Thank you so much. We were final panelist, Matthias Dewatripont. Thank you so much for being us. This is the second panel we're having with you, because you had joined us for the workshop we had earlier on COVID. Matthias is the professor of economics at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, Solvay's Brussels School. He's an honorary vice governor of the National Bank of Belgium, which he also represented at the Basel Committee from 2011 till 2017. And he was on the supervisory board of the European Central Bank also between 2014 and 2017. Matthias, it's a great pleasure to have you with us. Today, we wanted to kind of have take the banking union, European Banking Union, and beyond the knots and bolts, maybe you can share with us why it is one of the fundamental aspects of actually building trust as we're moving in this very uncertain times.
Thank you, Sherazad, and great to be here and among such a great panel. So indeed, I suggested I would talk about the banking union, but maybe I can start with 2 or 3 comments about some of the very interesting earlier talks. First of all, on Daron's point about the quality of the state and the trust in the state and so on, I do think that Europe provides some interesting data and comparison. The fact that Greece, not necessarily seen as a model state, and having been hurt a lot, especially in its health budget, by austerity, managed to have one of the lowest death toll per capita in Europe. I think it's interesting. By the way, southern Italy, again not seen as a model state system, has done much better than northern Italy. And I think that once you have control for, Asia is a bit different. They are used to this kind of thing. So the big problem here is that it was an unforeseen storm for both Europe and the US. But next to that, when you got hit, I mean, northern Italy was really unlucky to be hit kind of the first in Europe, because I think there are many Chinese workers working there. I think that explains a fair amount. That means, by the way, that the UK and the US that were hit later don't look that good. And there, I think a key element of having a leader who's not really pro-science and a bit arrogant and so on, just like Bolsonaro, I think that's a problem. The other problem is that a country which is seen as a model of governance, Sweden, is hit much, much harder than Denmark, Finland, or Norway, because they decided to take a more laid-back approach based on the idea of herd immunity that turned out not to be the good strategy. I think it's another element. I think that these kinds of things probably explain already a lot of the performance, but then it would be interesting to see. I agree with your points about a number of current problems about how we see the state and so on. But I think it should probably be qualified. As for coming to Europe, and so Marco's point about maybe this time we'll go more supranational and there will be more solidarity. I think there is a hope of that, because indeed, you know, being hit first by coronavirus is not your fault. It's just bad luck. It's not like having accumulated big deficits and big debts. This being said, I think just after the financial crisis, there was a lot of solidarity within Europe. There was a concerted effort to do Keynesian expansion. Plus, there was a decisive role of the ECB and so on. But while we were all caught off guard because we had underestimated the financial crisis, I think the first reaction was pretty good. And it's interesting, and I'm now transitioning towards my topic, it's interesting that things got worse in Europe around 2011, when we started having the sovereign crisis. So we had the sovereign crisis after the banking crisis, and there it became, solidarity became a much more of a problem. Interestingly, the banking union, which is somehow the biggest project of Europe since the euro and the enlargement, with the new institutions, single supervisory mechanism, single resolution mechanism, it was in fact an answer 3 years later to the financial crisis, while we were in another crisis. In fact, you could have seen, you know, if you have sovereign crisis, you need to put your fiscal house in order, and some form of fiscal union would have been the natural answer. That was, of course, politically impossible, and it's still very much difficult today. So, as often in Europe, you don't do necessarily what is optimal, but what is useful and politically possible. And at the time, the banking union was seen as politically possible. And it is a good idea, even though it was not a response to the sovereign crisis. Now, of course, what has always been difficult, and that's the idea of, indeed, we were not in a Rawlsian world at the time. We knew who the losers and winners would be. So solidarity is difficult, and therefore we have to navigate through that in the banking union too. And I think even more so because using public money to save banks is really very toxic. That's definitely not the thing you want to do with your taxpayers. If on top of that is taxpayer of country A that has to pay for a bank in country B, you can see that that won't be politically easy. So I think that what has been achieved with the banking union is impressive, especially because this issue faces multiple trust problems. not only the trust in the banking sector, which is always a problem. Banks are fragile animals because they borrow short and they lend long, so they are fragile. But also trust in the banking union by member states and between member states. As I say, you definitely don't want to have bailouts. And bailouts with European money, that's somehow the best way to make people worried about Europe. And so we have been in the years since the banking union, so since 2013, struggling with this question of how to have a sound banking sector in a challenging time where banks' profitability is not great because of persistently low interest rates and the zero lower bound problem, which reduces the interest margin, because of low growth, high non-performing loans, because competition from fintech and big tech. And so basically today, or at the end of 2019, before entering the new crisis, we had a kind of a so-so banking sector in Europe. So the banking sector is much more solid and more profitable in the US, but in Europe, we've entered the crisis, of course, in a better situation than in 2008, let's hope so, but not that great anyway. Huh? So leverage ratio between 3 and 5%, and probably for many banks, profitability below the cost of capital. So now why are we in this situation? Because basically, in order to really restructure the banking sector to make it more profitable and more solid, you need to raise capital requirements. And since people are not that happy to do that with private money, and since you don't want bailouts because that's politically toxic, we were a bit in the middle of the river. And the question is, will we be able to cross the river at a time where the recession will increase non-performing loans and the like? Now, I do think that if we use the urgency rightly, we have a chance to kind of use the crisis to improve things. And the chance is coming from the fact that all of a sudden, most countries, not everybody, but most countries are less stingy than before. You know, today, well, we almost live in fantasy land where deficits don't matter anymore and so on. Of course, there was a time too much austerity. Probably now we will see what happens in 2 years. So in that sense, it will be interesting whether the optimistic prediction of Marco will be borne out. But right now we have this opportunity to say, look, you know, the efficient way to deal with a weak banking sector is to insist on recapitalization with private money if possible, with public money if not. And of course, you have to design it in a way that will not be too costly for the state. So the state needs to have a right to the upside when things will go back up. Helping banks that are in trouble temporarily but are sustainably healthy can be a very good deal for the taxpayers. And you know, we have one in Belgium which was helped in the financial crisis, KBC, and the Belgian state put 7 billion in it and got 12 back, which is not bad. So thanks to the help of DG competition and the like. And so, you know, there might be an opportunity to restructure the banking sector, which is currently in overcapacity. And yesterday, the ECB was trying to push for mergers and cross-border mergers and the like. I think this would be a good idea. Of course, it has to be dealt with in a way that will not, that will overcome the current mistrust between various member states, and in particular the ones with the banks that will be acquiring the other banks, and those member states with the banks that will be acquired, and called in the jargon home and host countries. And with André Sapir and Lucretia Reiklin, we have been working on schemes that would allow for this. that would follow the Financial Stability Board idea of structural subordination and so on. But let me not get into that unless there are questions. But the point is that I agree with Marco that there may be opportunities today to kind of, as I say, use the crisis to put Europe, and in particular here, its banking sector, on even firmer footing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthias. We have a lot of questions both on Twitter and online on Zoom. We're going to start maybe with a first question for you, Daron, from Andrew Jones. He's asking you, in the most recent book, you and Professor Robinson speak of the shackled Leviathan. It seems your current advice and hope seems to be to increase the Leviathan's capacity to deal with a future crisis like COVID-19. How do you see society increasing its ability to shackle the Leviathan? I would also like to ask you, what kind of concrete action do you actually think that democracies today can take to reverse this whole temptation of totalitarianism?
Thank you, Sherazad, and thank you, Andrew. These questions are really at the heart of my thinking and what I was trying to communicate in my comments. The reason why James and I called our book The Narrow Corridor is precisely because we think of this area where you can control the Leviathan, shackle it, despite the fact that you don't want to disempower it completely, as a corridor, as a sort of something squeezed between too much power and too little power for the state. And the fact that it's narrow is communicating the idea that this is a very difficult balance. So it is easy to say, okay, we're just too afraid of the Leviathan, therefore we're not going to give it too much power. And I guess, in a sophisticated version, that's what Hayek was trying to advocate. But what our framework tries to articulate is that that's not the only option. You can have a very high capacity and at some level involved state, as long as you keep society institutionally and otherwise as involved, as engaged, that could balance it out. Now, the key is, it's never a static balance. What we try to articulate in the book is that conditions change. States always try to expand what they do and how they do it. That's why the way that politics, institutions, and society will have to respond to that is also dynamic, will continuously involve finding new ways of getting engaged in politics. But it becomes even more so during times of crises like this one, where we need a much greater set of responsibilities on the shoulders of the states, which is no different in some high level from what we experienced, say, after the Great Depression, after World War II. But specifically, what can we do when, rather than empty talk, what do we really mean by society being stronger and more involved? I think, if you look at the last 20 years, there has been a real sea change in terms of how strong democracies were before then and the trend towards greater democracy. So I think it's actually an endemic problem that's not just for the US or a few other countries. So I think this is, of course, part of a longer conversation. But, I think media plays a critical role in this, free media that sort of does not polarize but unites country on common issues. I think one of the reasons why I emphasize expertise and the bureaucracy is because that's actually a very important thing. I think history suggests that, rather than sort of the separation of powers between, legislature and the president, a much better way of restraining autocratic, authoritarian tendencies is to have an independent bureaucracy, independent civil service. So I think bolstering that is very important. I think facilitating democratic participation, which has slipped, is actually quite critical, and also introducing additional guardrails against authoritarian sort of overreach, which has to be something that you do on the basis of an institutional consensus. But I think there are some important ideas in those respects that I can talk more about, but I don't want to take more time in this question.
Thank you so much. A question from Brian Alexander here, and maybe there, I would want to ask, I'll read you the question, but then I'll go to Marco and then back to you actually, Daron. Brian is asking, why has American public health performed so badly in the crisis? I'm referring to the CDC as well as state governments, etc. I want to, before maybe Daron, since you're US speaker here, we want you to answer. However, just before, Marco, would love to hear from you. How do you assess Europe's performance, and why do you think Europe could have performed maybe better? Sorry, Marco, you're on mute.
Yes, the crisis hit coming out of the blue. So and it was a completely unknown crisis. What we have learned here from the financial crisis, even the crisis before, we always equip ourselves to win the past war. So the last war, not the new one. So we were not prepared for this, and there is no competence at the level of Europe on healthcare issues. So what we did, we tried at first to mobilize through soft coordination member states to actually show more activism, more solidarity, but it was on let's say moral suasion type of competences. So I think what happened is that member states themselves were clearly caught by surprise, and the initial reaction was a very defensive one. I think after that initial period, I think things also in the medical treatment actually improved quite a lot, and there were very concrete signs of solidarity on sharing medical equipment, on hosting patients from northern Italy in Slovakia or in Germany, and many concrete, tangible signs of solidarity on this. I think what happened afterwards, when the crisis sank in and we shifted the attention, at least in my portfolio, onto the economic response, I think there, as I argued before, the awareness that we need to provide a common, strong common response, and in the current environment, making Europe much more self-sufficient in terms of the capability to respond to the crisis, I think gave the chance, I think, to have a better response. I think what played an important role was the awareness that in a fractured world, having a model of growth which mainly or to a large extent relies on foreign demand is not an element of strength, is a fundamental element of weakness. So because you are subject to blackmailing or retortion and other political development, we have seen several of them. So I think this pushed, I think, to a response which is still being negotiated, as you know very well, in Brussels, but which has a chance, again, I think, to come out in a proper, with a proper response. And I have to say, I fully agree with Matthias, and I believe really that beside the agreement or in the negotiations here on the economic policy response, the litmus test for, let's say, maturity of Europe in dealing with the crisis and providing also a model for the rest of the world is actually on whether the matters that he discussed, so banking union, capital market union, fiscal union, will see concrete progress. So the litmus test, a bit paradoxically, is in these other matters, is not only in providing a concrete response right now.
Okay, thank you so much. Daron, do you want to rapidly address the health, the American health?
Yeah, let me sort of mention. I mean, I think people sometimes quip that nothing should have more than 3 causes because it gets too complicated. But I think there are actually a number of factors here that made this a perfect storm. I've emphasized 2 of them. You know, the fact that, you know, CDC, for example, failed, and the health bureaucracy failed, and the fact that trust running low meant people did not follow guidelines even well right now. That's ongoing. But I think 3 other aspects are important because they get to the nitty-gritty of it. First of all, you know, when you look at the data, you see that places that were more prepared because they had dealt with SARS or H1N1 had understood some aspects of it and had made better preparation. But I put that on the table not because of the history, but I think being prepared is very important. So the US is completely unprepared as a result of the political changes that I have highlighted. Second, inequality. I mean, I think we've seen many aspects that are of inequality that are corrosive, but I think the contribution of inequality to the deaths from COVID, I think, cannot be understated. And I think they really upped the ante of dealing with the inequality questions. And then the final one, I think that's really important. You know, if you look at the healthcare system everywhere in the world, but it's worse in the United States, we do much more for dealing with diseases ex post, once diseases are realized, and much less in terms of prevention and dealing with, you know, public health aspects of the problem. The US is terrible for that because we spend much more than any other country as a fraction of GDP, but still over 20 million people have no access to healthcare. Another 30 million have scattered access to healthcare. So a much more comprehensive pre-disease treatment mentality would really help for the next pandemic.
Thank you so much. Question for Matthias and Laurence. Laurence, a question from Mariana Baggio on Twitter. Trust is essential for public health interventions such as vaccination. How can we rebuild trust now that this is even more necessary in the fight against COVID? Matthias, you've got an academic work on how to make organizations more efficient, and at the same time, you've been working on the healthcare. So would love to hear from you on how we can rebuild trust. And Laurence, maybe you can then take us into, as you had mentioned, that there were the fairness in healthcare and international cooperation was very important. On how do you see if we need trust is with a clear purpose, and which institution do you see could restore trust in vaccination? And more generally, in such global science-based policies, and probably in there, you know, thinking a lot about all the tension right now around WHO, the US pulling out, would love to hear from you on that. Matthias, do you want to start? Give us maybe your view on how trust is essential for public health interventions such as vaccination and how you analyze that, and then would love to hear from Laurence on how more globally do you see the future of a more global science-based policy and institution.
Okay, of course, these issues of trust are indeed at some level global, and because indeed these viruses don't know frontiers. And what Laurence already said earlier about the importance of multilateral cooperation, of course, super important. But let me not invade that territory. I'm sure she will say all that is needed there. On the issue of trust, I do think that, well, first of all, on unpreparedness, at some level, we've been victim of our success. Rich countries, with the exception of HIV, have been focusing a lot and almost exclusively on the health problems of the day, which are chronic diseases. And this is a huge amount of budget, and I think at some level, I happened to be last year in a panel about the future of health in Belgium, and it was all about, indeed, cancer, heart disease, dementia, and so on. And it was not about the infectious diseases. Even though people do worry about, super bugs that are super resistant and you don't have enough antibiotics and all that. But let's face it, and when Daron talks about prevention, he's quite right that we are too much into correcting than preventing. But when people talk about prevention, which we did in our panel last year in our committee last year in Belgium, it was about improving ways that you eat so as to reduce obesity and stuff like that. So indeed, at some level, we've been caught off guard because we are not, and it's a bit one of the reasons why maybe in a number of African countries, they are dealing it better with it. They are dealing with it better than us because they are used to infectious diseases. So now, indeed, the problem, and that's coming back to the thing that Daron was mentioning about lack of trust in science experts and the like. One problem will be if we manage to find a vaccine. And let's face it, the good news about vaccines is that these diseases are not so strange and complicated than HIV. The bad news is that the vaccines against flu and things like that only work for 60–70% of the cases. So this won't necessarily be a magical solution. And on top of that, as we know, vaccine hesitancy is a big problem. And that's of course linked to all this problem of lack of trust about expertise and so on. And we know these things are just crazy, yeah? Like this famous or infamous Lancet paper about the MMS vaccine causing autism. It took the Lancet, which kind of one of the top 3 journals in medicine, 12 years to withdraw it. The guy happened to have a conflict of interest because he was pushing another type of vaccine for only one of the 3. At least this time, the 2 hydroxychloroquine papers were withdrawn faster. That's nice, but still, it was based on a database that did not really exist. So there's all this problem. Not everything is great in science either. There is a lot of competition, incentive problems, and the like. So it will be very important to communicate properly and the like. Of course, let's first have a vaccine that works, because that's the other problem. Politicians, especially if they face election, like for example on November 3rd, they would love to be able to announce a vaccine. Not being a big fan of the US president, I would rather have a vaccine as fast as possible, but after November 3rd. But this is a joke.
Daron, do you want to jump and say something before we go to Laurence?
Yes, I actually wanted to. I think this preparedness issue, I completely agree with what Matthias's comments, but I think we should really not belittle this preparedness issue. My thinking on this has changed, of course, after the COVID-19 crisis, but even before then, I felt uneasy with books like, Steven Pinker's books on Enlightenment Now or The Better Angels of Our Nature about how the world is getting better and better. And part of the reason why the world is getting better and better, there was because we say, we had lots of disasters in the past. And then we're looking after those disasters like World War II, and we're looking at a period when we've avoided other likely disasters, big pandemics and the nuclear war, despite the fact that we had ample capacity to destroy the world, and we're not, completely taking into account what damages we're creating with climate change. And then we'll look at it and we say, we're really getting better. And I think we're really getting worse and worse prepared for many things, including the climate change, including future pandemics. And I think, again, not about the past, but looking into the future, it is really imperative that we take this preparedness issue seriously and not really sort of say, okay, we've done okay in the past. I think that really is a very dangerous line. And I think that's part of the institutional imperative that I see moving forward.
Thank you. Laurence, up to you to give us maybe an overview of how you see trust around vaccination, healthcare, science, and your assessment.
Thanks, Chair. First, I'd like to come back on some of the points that were highlighted.
Sure.
And one of them is preparedness. And I'm sorry, but I don't think it's only Asia, because they had it before. if you look at it, Germany was much better prepared than the others, because as soon as January, they had a testing on they could test on a massive scales using labs vets, and they just had a super efficient administration on this. So I think, you know, I'm saying that because I think it's important to recognize that we have made mistakes, because it's only when we recognize that we have made mistakes that we can then look forward to look ahead to improvement. And that brings me to the second thing. I think there was a choice, you know, when Matthias said, or Daron, oh, well, you know, we have forgotten about prevention, and we have forgotten about preparedness. So first, prevention. Once again, Germany is doing a lot better at medical prevention than many other advanced economies. So I can understand that sometimes benchmarking may sound weak, but actually when government do pay attention to what others are doing, they can learn an awful lot. And in that case, in Europe, we should have paid attention to what was happening to Italy and to the way that Germany was being prepared. And when you think that it's the most integrated region of the world with the most organized dialogue of the world, it's very surprising. And I will add something to that, which is data. You know, we're already talking about a vaccine we haven't got, but we should start by harmonizing data. We don't measure the same way. We don't measure people being tested the same way. The basis of science is data. And it's true for the US, but I think it's also especially true for Europe, who doesn't measure dead people in the same way from one country to another. And it's not because health is not the responsibility of the union that harmonizing the way we measure people being affected or dying of COVID cannot be organized. So I think, if I may, I think we are being a little complacent here with our past mistake. We made some from data, we made some from preparation. And if we don't acknowledge that today, we will do the same tomorrow, which is why I wanted to come back on this. The other thing is, and it's something we are actually doing at the OECD, look back at our policy recommendation, and that's valid for IMF, World Bank, European Commission, and us. We have privileged efficiency over resilience for a very long time. You can look at some Article 4 or some OECD surveys or some European Commission focus where we were all accusing Germany, for example, of being, you know, too dispendious with its healthcare, having too many beds that were not utilized, and there wasn't an efficient use of resources. Well, I think today we have to admit that, you know, having stocks sometimes, balancing or striking the right balance between preparedness and efficiency, it's important. And that has also to do with the way we use public resources and the democratic choices that we are making on this. The question we should ask is, are we ready to spend more money on healthcare today? And by the way, that's also valid for the WHO as other organizations. The last, and coming a little more to trust, I was saying that because I think trust has to be built from the beginning. It's data, it's comparison of countries, it's transparency about what we know and what we don't know. And I don't think that was done well enough. And when it comes to vaccine, you mentioned, somebody mentioned the Lancet. The Lancet, again, in this episode also withdrew some of the analysis that has been done. Peer review for journals, comparison, debate, confrontation, benchmarking, making sure the methodology is good. I think in science, the veil of ignorance is only good to the extent that we acknowledge what it means. And that is something that we should also take into account. For the vaccine and trust, I think the first honesty to rebuild trust starts by saying that it takes time to build a vaccine. On average, it requires 6 to 7 years. Granted, this time, there are huge amounts of money being devoted to find something, so maybe it will only take a couple of years. But then the question we should start preparing today is, you know, how are we going to produce, manufacture, and distribute this vaccine so that everybody in the world can benefit from it? Because it's not because the US has it or the UK or France has it that it's a solution to the pandemic. As long as the virus circulates, we won't be able to live in the same way as before. And by the way, it will also be more difficult for people in emerging market economies or in low-income countries to benefit from this vaccine. So we should prepare today what I think would be a very massive and impressive act of conviction, a commitment by the international community that the vaccine will be available and distributed to everybody at a fair price when it is discovered. That would restore some of the trust which we have lost. Sorry, I've been a bit passionate from this, but I wanted to make this point.
We've got a couple of minutes left, and we're discussing a little bit what should be maybe a last question to our panelists. I would love to ask you, and here we're gonna a little bit plagiarize one of Daron's books title on Why Nations Fail, and ask you if you today feel your country or institution may fail, what is the one thing you would do to prevent that from happening? What is one recommendation you would give a president or your secretary general or the president of the commission? What's the one recommendation you would give them to make sure they won't fail and build trust? Laurence, do you want to go first? Because
that's unfair, but I think it's the opportunity to actually talk about something that I missed that I wanted to say. I think the stakeholders, we probably haven't talked enough about stakeholders. I think Daron mentioned it at the beginning. We're only as good and we can only survive is actually the population, citizens believe that we are bringing some value added to national policies. So the one thing which actually we have started doing, but I think it's really more inclusion of what people think. And I'm a very enthusiastic fan, for example, for this stream of economics that is with surveys about public acceptability and understanding what people think depending on their heterogeneity of situation. So that's the thing for me, which is the most important, communication with normal people.
Great, thank you so much. Daron, do you want to have your one recommendation?
Well, I mean, I think given the situation I have described, I think the U.S. and to some degree, I think the entire West is as close to failure as they have been since World War II. And in the U.S., I don't want to sound partisan, but the only way is to conclusively defeat the current administration because they have been at the root of almost all of the recent damage to institutions. And that's exactly what the only safeguard we have in democratic systems is to actually vote the rascals out. So I think that's it's the beginning, it's definitely not the end, and I'm not sure that it's an easy path from there. But the democratic institutions themselves have to find their own footing and their own confidence for the rest of it to work out.
Thank you. Change of leadership after listening more to the people. Matthias, do you want to share with us your one recommendation?
Well, I think as Marco had said, there is this chance for Europe to really improve. In Europe, Europe is kind of nation building in peace times, which is clumsy. Of course, it beats a nation building through wars. But as I say, it's often we are making some progress, but it's not always consistent and all that. So I think maybe the German presidency, which is started yesterday, is a way to really try and push for for enlightened solidarity. And so I hope that everybody will try and kind of close ranks and look at the common good. I do think also that learning the lessons of the relative levels of unpreparedness, and I had forgotten to mention Germany. Of course, Germany did much better than you know, Italy, Spain, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Sweden. But you know, you often expect Germany to do better. I think it's more interesting to see why countries as different as Greece or Hungary did so well, even better than Germany, frankly. And so maybe some modesty about you know, which kind of model we should follow, and trying to look in a non-ideological way about the taking a bit of the best aspects of everybody is kind of useful, I think, and trying to in an inclusive way try and look at the good things that can be copied across the various countries. So benchmarking indeed is very important. I fully agree with Laurence.
Thank you. Marco, you're...
Thank you very much. I mean, being the last is easier and more difficult. I had little time to think about it, unlike the others. Now, I think going back to Daron shackling the Leviathan, I actually see the role of the European Union, European Commission, in you know, helping the governments to do precisely that. This means that we work to make sure that public authorities optimize with a lower discount rate, let's put it like that. So they take into account the, I mean, a longer time horizon, and not only the very, you know, immediate future, also a motivation of being re-elected, basically. So I would really hope that from this episode here, we come out with, Matthias said, enlightened solidarity is actually more enlightened self-interest by countries, so that they can see that we are on the same boat. I think this is the general picture, but in order to do so, I think we have to make sure that once the crisis is over, or once we start to see the light at the end of the tunnel, that we do not reverse the good propositions that we have uttered during the financial crisis. I think this implies to do many things that actually Laurence mentioned before. We have to look at the plumbing, so that we build robust institutions, not only institutions just in name, but looking at the whole movie, so that we can actually build the all the infrastructure which allows to do the preparation and to be, you know, better prepared for the next crisis, which we don't know when and from where it will come. So some you know, I think modest proposals, looking at the plumbing, making sure the infrastructure is robust enough, and at the end of the day, this will deliver result and underpin the trust that we know will have to be rebuilt in the aftermath of the crisis.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much. So more robust infrastructure, having the right leadership, trust, transparency, and higher solidarity. Thank you so much for all of you joining us. Thank you also to our audience. There were many other questions. I want to thank again Georgetown, ULB, GRC of the European Commission, and the CEPR for sponsoring us today. Thank you so much. Again, thanks to Frank Vella and Mikhail Castanheira, who are the great organizer behind these panels. And thank you again, Daron, Matthias, Laurence, and Marco for taking the time being with us. And we hope to have you soon for another workshop. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.